The year was 1978, and the Salvatierra family lived far from the chaos of the city. Their home was a sprawling ranch in northern Argentina, with red clay roads winding through golden fields, pastures dotted with cattle, and mountains that rose like silent giants in the distance. Don Emilio Salvatierra, the head of the family, was a man whose life had been shaped by both hard work and personal loss. His wife had passed away nearly a decade earlier, leaving him to raise his only son, Andres, alone. Though grief had carved lines into his face, Don Emilio carried himself with the dignity of a man who understood his duty to his land, to his family, and to the values passed down from generations before him. The ranch ran on routine. Sunrise meant the smell of coffee and fresh bread from the kitchen. Midday was for tending the livestock, repairing fences, and working in the fields. Evenings were quiet, often filled with the sound of the radio or the low hum of crickets outside. For years, this predictable rhythm was a comfort to both father and son, but life has a way of changing without warning. One rainy afternoon in early June, news arrived from the neighboring town, news that would alter the course of their lives forever. A close friend of Don Emilio, a man named Ernesto, had been killed instantly in a tragic car accident. Ernesto had been more than just a friend. He was someone Don Emilio had grown up with, worked alongside in the early years, and trusted like a brother. Ernesto left behind one thing in this world, a daughter named Clara. She was only 14, with no mother, no siblings, and no other close relatives. The shock of losing her father so suddenly left her adrift, a fragile soul in a world that had just shown her its cruelest face. When Don Emilio heard the news, he didn't hesitate. He had once promised Ernesto that if anything happened to him, he would look after Clara as his own. Promises meant something to Don Emilio, especially to a man who knew what it meant to lose family. Without a second thought, he drove into town the next morning to bring her home. Clara arrived at the Salvatierra ranch on a cold afternoon, carrying a single small suitcase that seemed almost too light, as if it contained more memories than possessions. Her dark hair hung in a simple braid, her eyes were swollen from days of crying, and her posture carried the weight of someone who had aged far beyond her years in a matter of days. The first time Andres saw her, he was struck by how fragile she looked. At 17, he was just a few years older than her, but in that moment, he felt a kind of protective instinct he hadn't experienced before. He greeted her awkwardly, unsure whether to treat her like a guest or like family. Don Emilio led her inside and showed her the small bedroom next to Andres's. "This is your home now," he said simply, his voice steady but warm. There was no grand speech, no exaggerated gestures, just a man keeping his word. In the days that followed, Clara remained quiet. She ate her meals politely, helped in the kitchen when asked, and spent long hours in her room. The grief was fresh, and though she was surrounded by people who meant well, she felt like a stranger in a place that wasn't yet hers. The house smelled different, the land looked different. Even the silence at night was a different kind of silence from what she had known. Still, small moments began to soften the edges of her sorrow. One morning, Andres invited her to join him on a ride across the ranch. At first she declined, but later that week she accepted. They rode in silence at first, the sound of hooves crunching against the dry earth filling the space between them. Then Andres pointed out a hawk circling above the fields, telling her how they could predict the weather by the way the birds moved. It was the first time she smiled since arriving. That smile was a turning point, not for romance, not yet, but for belonging. She began to open up slowly, asking about the ranch, helping with small chores, and even laughing at some of Andres's clumsy jokes. Don Emilio noticed these changes quietly. He never spoke about them, but deep down he felt a sense of relief. The promise he made to Ernesto was more than just a duty. It was a chance to give this girl a life where she could feel safe and valued. No one in the Salvatierra household could have predicted that Clara's arrival, an act of kindness born from tragedy, would be the seed of a story that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and morality. But for now, in 1978, all that mattered was that she had found shelter from the storm. The first months after Clara's arrival were filled with quiet adjustments. Though she had found shelter in the Salvatierra home, grief still clung to her like a heavy coat she could not take off. She often sat by the small window in her room, staring at the horizon as if waiting for someone who would never come. Andres, just 17 at the time, noticed these silences. He had lost his mother years before, so he understood, at least in part, the strange ache of losing the person who anchored your world. At first, he treated Clara like a younger sister, teasing her lightly about her timidness, but always stopping short when he saw the sadness in her eyes. Don Emilio, for his part, treated her with quiet firmness. She was expected to follow the same rules as Andres, help with chores, keep up with school, and respect the house's routine. But he was also patient. He never pressured her to move on or cheer up too quickly. He knew time had its own pace when it came to healing. Slowly, Clara began to adapt to ranch life. In the mornings, she helped in the kitchen, kneading dough alongside the housekeeper, Dona Marta. Sometimes she joined Andres to feed the chickens or help in the vegetable garden. In the afternoons, she rode to the small village school, her books pressed tightly to her chest. At first, the villagers whispered. It wasn't common for an unrelated teenage girl to suddenly live under the same roof as a father and son. But Don Emilio's reputation as a man of integrity silenced most gossip before it could grow. She is like my daughter, he told anyone who asked. A promise to her father brought her here, and a promise will keep her here. The years began to pass, marked by the steady rhythm of rural life. Seasons turned the land from green to gold to brown and back again. Clara grew from a shy, thin-faced teenager into a young woman with quiet confidence. Her once guarded smile became warmer, her laughter more frequent. She was smart, too. Her teachers often praised her for her diligence. Andres, meanwhile, was stepping into manhood. By 19, he had taken on more responsibility at the ranch, managing cattle sales and fixing equipment with the ease of someone born to the work. He and Clara shared countless small moments, walking home from town together, sitting on the porch during summer storms, exchanging playful arguments over who made the better coffee. They bickered like siblings sometimes, but their connection was deeper than that. When Clara fell ill one winter, Andres stayed by her side, bringing her soup and reading aloud from her schoolbooks so she wouldn't fall behind. When Andres injured his hand fixing a fence, Clara cleaned and wrapped the wound herself, scolding him for being careless. It was a closeness born from years of shared spaces, shared struggles, and shared trust. To them, it felt natural. To outsiders, it might have looked like something more, but inside the walls of the Salvatierra home, it was simply life. By the time Clara turned 18, she was no longer the girl who had arrived with one small suitcase. She had become part of the very fabric of the ranch, someone who knew every creak of the floorboards, every shortcut through the fields, every stubborn animal by name. But with adulthood came subtle changes neither she nor Andres could ignore. They began noticing things they hadn't before, a lingering glance, a strange awareness in the quiet moments. Their conversations became more personal, dipping into dreams, fears, and unspoken longings. It was nothing inappropriate, not yet. They still behaved as they always had, still helped each other with chores, still laughed at the same silly things, but under the surface something was shifting. Neither dared to name it, because to name it would make it real, and to make it real would be to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Don Emilio remained unaware, or perhaps he simply saw what he wanted to see. In his eyes, Andres and Clara were like brother and sister. He had raised them under the same roof, and to him that bond was sacred. Yet life has a way of complicating even the simplest arrangements. The more time they spent together, the more that unspoken tension grew. It was like a seed buried deep in the soil, hidden, silent, but waiting for the right conditions to push through the surface. For now, they continued as they always had, two young people bound by shared history, growing side by side under the roof of the Salvatierra home. But the quiet undercurrents of change were already moving, and soon, those currents would sweep them toward a future neither of them had planned. By the time Clara reached her 20th birthday, the ranch felt like the only world she had ever known. The dirt roads, the smell of rain on dry earth, the way the hills glowed at sunset, it was all as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Andres was now 23, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, his face weathered by the sun and wind. He had grown into a man of quiet strength, someone the ranch hands respected without question. Clara, too, had changed. The shy girl with downcast eyes was gone. In her place stood a young woman with a calm confidence, a warm laugh, and a way of speaking that made people feel at ease. They had spent so many years together that their lives were seamlessly intertwined. They worked side by side on the ranch, took trips into town together, and shared meals every evening with Don Emilio. From the outside, their closeness still seemed like that of siblings. Unshakable, comfortable, easy. But under the surface, something was different now. It began with moments so small they might have been dismissed as nothing. A glance that lingered too long. The way Andres' hand would brush against Clara's when they passed each other tools. The softness in his voice when he spoke her name. Clara noticed but said nothing. She wasn't sure if she was imagining it or if she simply wanted to imagine it. One late summer evening, they were sitting on the porch after a long day of work. The sun was sinking behind the hills, turning the sky shades of gold and violet. Andres leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara sat beside him, sipping tea. The silence between them felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full, almost heavy. "You ever think about leaving here?" Andres asked suddenly. "Leaving?" Clara tilted her head. "Why would I? This is home." Andres gave a small, almost sad smile. "Sometimes I wonder if there's more for us out there, for you." She looked at him, trying to read his face. "More for us, or more for me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was the kind of gesture that seemed harmless, but it made Clara's heart race in a way she couldn't explain. From that night on, it became harder to ignore the truth. What they felt wasn't the easy affection of brother and sister. It was deeper, heavier, something that carried both comfort and danger. Andres wrestled with it silently. He knew what people would think. He knew how his father would react. To Don Emilio, Clara was like a daughter. And to cross that line would be to break his trust in the worst possible way. But the more Andres tried to push his feelings aside, the stronger they grew. Clara was no stranger to the same battle. She had been taught her whole life to value loyalty, to respect those who had given her a home. And yet, when she looked at Andres, she didn't see a brother. She saw the boy who had once taught her to ride a horse, who had made her laugh when she thought she'd never smile again, who had stood by her through every season of her life. The moment neither of them could turn back from came on a rainy night in early spring. The ranch hands had gone home early, and Don Emilio was away visiting a neighboring farm. Clara and Andres were working together in the barn, trying to keep the animals calm as the storm rattled the walls. At one point, Andres reached for a rope at the same time Clara did, and their hands met. They froze, their eyes locking in the dim light. The sound of rain against the roof filled the silence between them. Without thinking, Andres whispered, "I've tried to see you as my sister, but I can't anymore." Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her breath caught in her throat, and in that moment, everything unspoken between them became painfully clear. She didn't move away. She didn't tell him to stop. When he finally let go of her hand, they both knew there was no going back. Something had shifted, and whether they wanted it to or not, it would change everything. That night, neither of them slept well. The storm outside had passed, but inside, a new one had begun. One that carried the weight of love, desire, and the unshakable knowledge that the path ahead would be anything but simple. For nearly 2 years, Clara and Andres carried their secret like a fragile glass they were afraid to drop. They never spoke of it openly, never made grand declarations. Their bond was lived quietly, in small touches, shared glances, and moments that spoke volumes without words. They thought they were careful. They thought no one would notice. But life has a way of revealing what people try hardest to hide. It was late autumn when it happened. The air was crisp, the leaves on the poplar trees along the driveway turning shades of yellow and orange. Don Emilio had left early that morning to attend a meeting in town. Andres and Clara were alone on the ranch, tending to repairs on one of the old storage barns. It wasn't anything dramatic. No stolen kiss in the open, no reckless display. They were simply talking, laughing over something trivial, when Andres reached over and brushed a smudge of dirt from Clara's cheek. His hand lingered just a moment too long. Neither of them knew that Don Emilio had returned earlier than expected. He had decided to skip the meeting, feeling under the weather. As he walked toward the barn, he saw them through the open doorway. The sight stopped him cold. It wasn't just what Andres did, it was how Clara looked at him. Her expression was soft, unguarded, the kind of look that belonged between lovers, not between two people he believed were like brother and sister. For a long moment, Don Emilio stood in the shadows, saying nothing. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, in a voice that was calm but carried an edge like a blade, he called out, "Andres." The sound of his father's voice made Andres stiffen. Clara stepped back instinctively, her eyes wide. "What is this?" Don Emilio asked, stepping into the barn. He didn't shout, but the weight in his tone was heavier than anger. Andres opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had rehearsed dozens of ways to tell his father someday, but not like this, not caught off guard with no chance to explain. "It's not what you think," he began, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Don Emilio's gaze shifted from his son to Clara. "I took you into this home as my daughter," he said slowly, his voice thick with disbelief. "I trusted you. I trusted both of you." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to explain that she hadn't planned this, that love had crept in quietly without warning, but she knew anything she said now would sound like an excuse. "Tell me this isn't true," Don Emilio demanded. Neither of them answered. The silence was the confession. He turned away from them, pacing the length of the barn, his boots crunching against the hay-strewn floor. "Do you understand what this means, what people will say, what it does to this family's name?" His voice rose, not in rage, but in hurt. Andres stepped forward. "Father, I love her. I can't pretend I don't, and she's not my sister, not by blood. That doesn't matter." Don Emilio snapped, his composure finally breaking. "I raised you both under the same roof. I trusted you to protect her, not..." He stopped himself, unable to finish. Clara felt tears burning her eyes, but she held them back. She knew this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected the sharpness of his disappointment to cut so deep. Finally, Don Emilio spoke again, his tone quieter now, but no less stern. "You have shamed this house. If this is the life you choose, you cannot live it here, not under my roof." The words hit harder than any shouted insult could have. They weren't just being told to leave, they were being told they no longer belonged. Andres glanced at Clara. There was fear in her eyes, but also something else, resolve. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Without arguing further, Andres took her hand, and together they walked past Don Emilio, out of the barn, and into the cool autumn air. Behind them, the man who had been father to them both stood in the doorway, his figure framed by the fading light. He didn't call after them, he didn't watch them go. That day, something broke in the Salvatierra family that would never fully be mended. And yet, for Clara and Andres, it was also the day they stopped hiding. The cost was high, perhaps higher than they had yet realized, but the truth was out and there was no turning back. Leaving the Salvatierra ranch that day felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea what lay below. Clara and Andres didn't take much with them. Just a few changes of clothes, some personal keepsakes, and the small savings Andres had managed to put aside from selling cattle over the past year. They didn't speak much as they walked down the long dirt road away from the only home they had known together. Every step carried a weight neither could ignore. The ranch had been more than a house. It was history, safety, and belonging. Walking away meant losing not just Don Emilio's roof, but his respect, his blessing, and the quiet assurance that they had a place in his heart. They moved to a nearby town, renting a small, rundown room in the back of an old widow's house. The walls were thin, the roof leaked when it rained, and the single window faced an alleyway that smelled faintly of garbage, but it was theirs. Andres found work in a mechanic's shop, using the skills he had picked up fixing tractors and farm equipment. The pay was meager, but it was honest. Clara, determined not to depend entirely on him, took a job helping in a local school as a teacher's assistant. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her purpose and a chance to contribute. The first year was the hardest. Money was tight, and some nights they went to bed hungry. They were outsiders in the town, and though no one said it to their faces, Clara knew the whispers followed them. People could do math. They knew she had once been taken in by Don Emilio as a daughter. Now she was living with his son. To many, that was scandal enough to dismiss them entirely. But Clara and Andres had made a decision. If they were going to be together, they would face the consequences without flinching. They didn't try to convince others to approve. Instead, they focused on building a life they could be proud of. Andres worked long hours at the shop, often coming home with oil-stained hands and sore muscles. Clara took evening classes to earn her teaching certificate, studying late into the night while Andres slept beside her. There were arguments about bills, about exhaustion, about whether they had made the right choice, but there was also a stubborn loyalty between them that kept them moving forward. In their lowest moments, Clara would think of the life she had left behind, the warm kitchen, the fields at sunset, Don Emilio's steady presence. The thought of him still made her chest tighten. She didn't regret loving Andres, but she did regret the pain they had caused. That regret never left her completely. 2 years passed, and their small life began to take shape. Andres saved enough to rent a modest house, a single-story place with peeling paint and a small patch of land where Clara planted flowers. It wasn't much, but it was home. The day they married was quiet and simple. There were no guests from the Salvatierra ranch, no family heirlooms, no grand celebration. Just a civil ceremony, 2 witnesses from the neighborhood, and the exchange of rings they could barely afford. Yet, as they stood there in front of the magistrate, hands clasped tightly, they both knew they were making a promise as unshakable as the one Don Emilio had once made to Clara's father. Still, the shadow of his absence lingered. Clara wrote letters to Don Emilio over the years, not to beg for forgiveness, but to let him know they were well. Sometimes she received no reply. Other times, a brief note would come, polite but distant. It was as if he needed to keep them at arm's length to protect himself from reopening the wound. One winter, word reached them that Don Emilio had fallen ill. Without hesitation, Clara and Andres traveled back to the ranch. Time had aged him. His hair was whiter, his frame thinner, but his eyes were still sharp. The meeting was not tearful or dramatic. There were no apologies shouted, no embraces that erased the years. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement. He shook Andres' hand. He looked at Clara for a long moment, and though his lips didn't form the words, his eyes seemed to say, "You kept your promise to each other. I can respect that." Clara stayed for weeks, helping care for him in his final days. She didn't do it for reconciliation. She did it because love in all its forms still lived in her heart for the man who had once taken her in. When Don Emilio passed, Andres stood beside her at the funeral, holding her hand as they laid him to rest on the land that had shaped all their lives. It was then Clara realized something important. The choice they had made years earlier had cost them dearly, but it had also forged them into people who could stand on their own, weather hardship, and keep going. It had taught them that love, real love, wasn't about avoiding pain but enduring it together. Years passed, and the Salvatierra name remained a whisper in the town of Santa Rosario. People spoke of them cautiously, as if afraid that too much curiosity would awaken old ghosts. By now, the events that had once shocked the community had faded into the realm of half-remembered gossip, told only in quiet corners, but for those who had lived through it, those who had witnessed the truth about Miguel and Isabella, their story had not been forgotten. Isabella had built a life far away from the dusty streets where it all began. She didn't hide from her past, but she also didn't let it define her. When people asked about her younger years, she told the truth, sometimes gently, sometimes with the raw edge of pain, but always with a clear focus, to make others understand the cost of living without boundaries. She would say, "We didn't mean for it to happen, but we didn't stop it when we should have, and that is where the danger lies. Love without wisdom can destroy more than it creates." Miguel, on the other hand, stayed in Santa Rosario, quietly working the same land his father had left him. Life had humbled him. The confidence he once carried had turned into a slow, deliberate way of moving through the world, as if he weighed every decision against the mistakes of his past. He rarely spoke about Isabella, but in his eyes, those who knew him could see the ache that never fully left. They had not seen each other in years, not because of anger or hatred, but because they understood that sometimes the greatest proof of love is distance. Staying apart was their way of protecting each other from the pull that had nearly consumed them once before. But even apart, their choices had changed them forever. In the years that followed, young people in Santa Rosario grew up hearing their story, not in the mocking tone of scandal, but in the serious voice of warning. Parents would tell their children, "Guard your heart. Love can be beautiful, but it must also be right." Isabella began speaking at local community events, especially to teenage girls. She didn't romanticize her past. She told them about the nights she couldn't sleep, the friendships she lost, and the way a single choice can lead you down a road you can't turn back from. She spoke of how attraction, when left unchecked, can blur every line until you no longer know where right ends and wrong begins. Miguel, too, found ways to pass on the lesson. He started mentoring young men who worked on his farm, telling them about responsibility, not just for themselves, but for the people who trusted them. He taught them that strength isn't in taking what you want, but in walking away when it could harm someone else. In a way, they had both turned their pain into purpose. They could not change the past, but they could make sure others learned from it. One summer, nearly 20 years after that fateful day when the truth had first shattered their lives, Isabella returned to Santa Rosario. She came not to reopen old wounds, but to lay flowers on the grave of Miguel's father, the man who had raised them both under the same roof. Miguel was there, standing quietly at the edge of the cemetery. For a moment, time seemed to rewind. They looked at each other, and all the memories, the joy, the confusion, the heartbreak, flashed between them. They didn't embrace, they didn't speak of what could have been. Instead, Isabella simply said, "I hope you've been well." Miguel nodded, "Better than I deserve." There was no bitterness, only a deep understanding that what they once shared could never belong to the present. It was a chapter forever closed, but one that had shaped the way they both lived the rest of their lives. The Salvatierra story became something more than just a tale of forbidden love. It became a reminder that even the most complicated chapters of life can be turned into guidance for others. People in the community would say they were not perfect, but they taught us something priceless, that real love must be guided by truth, not just feeling. And that was the lesson they left behind, that boundaries matter. That temptation is powerful but not unstoppable, that a single choice can define your life, but so can the courage to walk away. In the end, Miguel and Isabella were not remembered for their mistakes alone. They were remembered for the way they chose to live after them, and in that they found a kind of redemption neither of them had ever expected.